Today, we're going to dive into a powerful idea that got completely twisted over time, a blueprint for society that was corrupted into something pretty much unrecognizable. We're going to unpack the original concept of Varna, look at how it devolved into the rigid caste system, and then see how a modern take on it might just give us a whole new way to understand history itself.
Okay, let's just start with this, because it's a really provocative claim and it's our launchpad for today. The argument here isn't that social roles are bad. I mean, hierarchies exist everywhere. The real disaster, the core failure, was a change in the operating system. A system designed to assess what you can do was ripped out and replaced by the lottery of who you were born to. And that one simple change had absolutely devastating consequences. So, to really get what went wrong, we have to rewind and look at the original blueprint. What was this idea of Varna before it became a tool for oppression? Well, it started out as less of a social ladder and more of a psychology of society. This verse from the Bhagavad Gita, this is the bedrock. It says society naturally breaks down into 4 broad types based on just 2 things: Guna, your inner nature, your disposition, and karma, the work you actually do in the world. Now look closely at what's missing, what's not in that verse. There's 0 mention of birth, of bloodline, of heredity. And that right there is the most crucial point. So this principle, Guna karma, is the engine of the original system. Think of Guna as your internal wiring, your natural psychological tendency. And karma is how that wiring gets expressed through your job, your actions. It's a dynamic idea. Your social role is supposed to be a reflection of who you are and what you do, not who your parents happen to be. And here's how that all breaks down into 4 broad archetypes. First, you've got the Shudra, who's grounded in the material world, forming the productive base of society. Then there's the Kshatriya, dynamic and decisive, the natural political and military leaders. After them, the Vipra, the intellectual type, who shapes a society's ideas and culture. And finally, the Vaishya, with that acquisitive mindset, driving trade and the economy. The key here is to see this as a framework for social functions, not a rigid, lifelong ranking. But of course, we all know that original blueprint didn't last. A kind of great substitution happened that twisted the whole idea. The entire system got warped from one based on assessing merits to one based completely on who your father was. And right here, you can see the transformation laid bare. On one side, you have the original idea. It's dynamic, it's based on merit, and it's always open to being revised. It assumes you can and should assess where a person fits. But on the other side, you have its corruption, Janma, or birth-based caste. It's static, it's hereditary, it's permanent. The whole idea of assessment is just thrown out the window. Your destiny is sealed the moment you're born.
So let's be crystal clear on this. The catastrophe wasn't the idea that society has different roles, thinkers, leaders, producers. The catastrophe was welding people to those roles for life, based on their family tree. It was the total elimination of any mechanism for mobility, for reevaluation, for talent to rise no matter where it came from.
And this wasn't some accident. This was a system that was deliberately built and defended. So how'd they build the wall so high? Well, first, through endogamy, forcing people to marry within their own group to seal the boundaries biologically. Second, by inventing concepts of ritual purity, which created this huge social distance and made exclusion seem natural. And finally, by going back and reinterpreting religious texts to give us rigid structure, a false stamp of divine approval.
Now, the consequences of this went way beyond social injustice, as horrific as that was. It led to what you could call an epistemic collapse, a failure of knowledge. The civilization as a whole basically lost its ability to learn from its own mistakes because it got rid of all the feedback mechanisms. Let's just pause on this for a second, because this is such a critical insight. I mean, think about any system that actually works. In science, in business, in technology, what's the one thing it depends on? Feedback, data, criticism, the ability to self-correct. By getting rid of merit-based assessment, the system got rid of feedback. It created a society that was flying blind. It couldn't self-correct. That's the real disease. You see, by replacing assessment with inheritance, the system basically switched off its most vital functions. It could no longer select the best talent for the job because the job was assigned at birth. It choked out new ideas because everyone was locked in place. And it killed the feedback loop you need for any kind of correction. The engine of civilizational progress just ground to a halt. But the story doesn't just end there and collapse. Fast forward to the 20th century, when the philosopher P. Sarkar took this ancient psychological framework and did something pretty remarkable with it. He reinterpreted it as a dynamic theory to explain the great cycles of history. Sarkar's brilliant insight was to ask a simple question. What happens when one of these psychological types doesn't just describe a person, but comes to dominate an entire society, an entire era? He argued that history actually moves in a cycle, with each of these Varna mentalities taking its turn in the driver's seat. So the cycle kicks off with the Shudra age. This is an era where society is organized around the collective, around manual labor, just basic survival. There's not much differentiation. The worker mentality is king. But out of that collective, the Kshatriya emerges, the warrior, the administrator. This is the age of the rising state, of military might, of law and order. The dominant figures are kings and generals who value courage, command, and control above all else. Of course, brute force can't rule forever. The Kshatriya age eventually gives way to the Vipra age, where power shifts to the intellectuals. The priests, the scholars, the ideologues. They don't rule with the sword. They rule with ideas, with dogma, and with scripture, controlling the minds of the people. And after the age of ideas comes the age of wealth. In the Vaishya age, the merchants and the capitalists take over. Power gets concentrated in the hands of people who control capital and the market. The number one social value becomes acquisition and profit. But this inevitably leads to massive exploitation, which causes social unrest, and then boom, the cycle resets, often with a Shudra revolution. So the big question is, are we just doomed to repeat this cycle of domination and exploitation forever? Well, Sarkar argued, no. He actually proposed a way to break the cycle by recovering the best parts of that original blueprint and evolving it into a new social ideal. And that ideal is the Sadvipra. Now, this isn't just another ruling class. A Sadvipra is a balanced individual who brings together the best of all four types. They're courageous like a Kshatriya, knowledgeable like a Vipra, practical like a Vaishya, and hardworking like a Shudra. But here's the crucial part. They're motivated by service, not domination. Their role is to be a kind of social conscience, hitting the brakes whenever any one class gets too powerful. Honestly, in today's incredibly complex high-tech world, this vision for integrated ethical leadership feels more relevant than ever. So in the end, we have two really powerful lenses here. The original Gita verse helps us understand individual psychology and function. And Sarkar's expansion gives us this incredible sociological tool to analyze the grand movements of history and the roots of social inequality. And that brings us to the fundamental challenge that this whole story leaves us with. From this dynamic philosophy, to a rigid, oppressive system, to a theory of historical cycles, it all boils down to this one question. How do we, in any society, build systems that reward merit and contribution, but also stay flexible? How do we find the courage to accept that status should be earned and can be lost, instead of clinging to the false security of inheritance? That really is the question to ponder.